Hello, and on behalf of Grant Thornton, a warm welcome to this Autumn Statement Analysis programme. And thank you very much for taking the time out to be with us today. Well, with the government looking to recover from a turbulent time and plug a substantial funding gap, during this broadcast, we're going to discuss what the recent autumn statement means for the UK economic outlook and what actions businesses can potentially take to mitigate the impact of increasing costs and inflationary pressures, and how you can prepare more effectively in response to the key announcements. So during the first 30 minutes of this webinar, we're going to set the overall scene before we then split into two separate sessions, one focusing on the private sector and the other focusing on the public sector in more detail. And we'll also be analysing exactly how the recent announcements could impact you if you're joining the private sector session, or alternatively, we'll look at how they impact you if you're joining the public sector session. Now, towards the end of the broadcast, we will have time for a dedicated question and answer session. So please do start sending in your questions and comments throughout. Details of how to do that should be on the screen via Slido. And if you want to ask a question to a particular speaker, then my recommendation is to jot the name of the speaker down alongside your question. And we'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can, time permitting. I'd also like to thank the audience members that joined our broadcast slightly earlier than advertised. Thank you very much for staying with us. We do really appreciate your commitment to finding out about exactly what's going on with the autumn statement analysis and how it might impact you and how you can best prepare for it. So let's meet the panellists who are taking part in the first part of the programme. And I'd like to welcome Shellyan, Alistair, Abby and Karen. And I'll get them to briefly tell you a little bit about their areas of expertise within Grant Thornton individually. So first of all, a warm welcome to Shellyan Horn. Shellyan is partner of the economic consulting team. Shellyan, good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So tell us a little bit about your expertise.
Yes, I work with the public sector and corporates on regulation, competition and policy development. I'm currently working with a number of corporates to understand the impact of the economy and changing regulations on their businesses and some of the measures they can put in place to deal with it.
Indeed, I know you've had a busy couple of weeks as well, so looking forward to hearing your comments about the outlook for the UK's economic scene and outlook. So next up we have Alistair Granger. Alistair is a net zero director at Grant Thornton, but I know has lots of years of experience of energy and business policy expertise at the heart of the UK government. So just bring that to life.
Sure. So I joined Grant Thornton about a year ago. Prior to that, I was in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, where I led a team of corporate finance professionals, providing effectively an internal consultancy to that department. And I did that type of role for about 10 years within the senior civil service within government. And about a year ago, as I said, came to Grant Thornton to set up a new net zero team. And so we're working with clients to advise them principally on the financing and supporting projects within the net zero space. And that's something that we're building the team up for and have won some great clients, many of whom are on this call, I think, in this first year and looking to grow from beyond.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alistair. And a warm welcome to Abby Agopian, who's Head of Tax Policy. And I know Abby, relatively new to the business, joined 3 weeks ago, where you did a similar role prior to that with the CBI. So good to have you here. How's it been?
Yeah, thank you. So it's been great. So I'm 3 weeks in. Previously, I was Head of Tax Policy at the Confederation of British Industry. So my role is very much focused on tax policy changes, what's coming down the track and what that can mean for businesses and our clients.
Brilliant. Look forward to hearing from you later on. And finally, welcome to Karen Campbell-Williams, Head of Tax and a member of the Strategic Leadership Team leading Grant Thornton's UK tax business. Great to have you here as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nadine. So do you want me to add? So in terms of my role, it's a split role. So I spend a significant amount of my time running our tax business operationally, sort of developing and implementing our strategy. But the other half of my time, I am a tax partner on the tools. So I work with clients. My sort of specialist area is really privately held, privately owned businesses, private equity backed businesses and their owners. So that's my sort of area of focus.
Brilliant. Well, it's great, isn't it, to have a diverse panel of experts across Grant Thornton. And let's set the scene by finding out their reactions to last week's autumn statement. And let's start with you, Shellyan, if you don't mind. So what's your view from an economic perspective, please?
Yes, we were here obviously talking about this, and I wanted to say months ago, but I think it was, 6-8 weeks ago, and I think so much has changed in the last 6-8 weeks. So, this was really a budget about stability. It wasn't about growth. It was about no surprises. It was about demonstrating to the OBR that the maths added up. So this time we got the maths right, we could afford this and it added up. And it was a real mix of sort of the increase in taxation or, increasingly people being dragged into that tax net, about borrowing, and also around caution around public spending. Most of the announcements were shared in advance. There were very few surprises, and the markets reacted well to that. So, the Truss era, the yield on government bonds was around sort of 2.5%. Jumped up to 4.5% following our last, we've got a mini budget, and it's now back around 3%. So the market reacted well, and we're seeing a sort of decline in the yield on government bonds, which indicates that sort of the international community are beginning again to have faith in our economic policies. Hunt went very much for the middle ground. It was about protecting the vulnerable. So the minimum wage has gone up for those over 23, and he kept the triple lock. So those pensioners, those on mean tested benefits, get those increases in line with inflation. But there was relief for public sector bodies too. So I think there was some concern that he may look to cut public sector spending, and we're far from austerity with this budget. And we actually saw some increases. So, councils can now raise council tax by 5% rather than 3% without a referendum. And there are increases for health and defence too. Although worth noting, these are nominal increases. So actually, given the rate of inflation, these departments are still going to have to be thinking about how they can do more with less. The government gave itself 5 years to hit its debt and spending targets, not 3. But I think that will still mean post-election we will be looking at what we can do with public spending, and I expect to see sort of some of the cuts have probably been delayed rather than sort of taken off the table altogether.
And I suppose the good news is that the government, the Bank of England, seem to be back in collaboration again.
Yeah, so obviously last time we spoke we were saying it was like they were on a different planet. So, the government was pumping money in saying spend more, please spend more. And the Bank of England was saying please don't spend more. We've got inflation going up, please stop. This time round, the Bank of England is still looking to bring back inflation to 2%. And it was, forecasting a 6-quarter recession. I don't think that's changed, but we're looking at probably interest rate increases now 4-5% to achieve that rather than that 5-6%. And that's because the government measures haven't put more money into the economy. If anything, they've depressed spending. So they're working alongside the Bank of England. And I think businesses will welcome the fact that we are looking for a lower peak in interest rates.
Yes.
So that will come as welcome relief. And obviously the OBR has shown it's all, all added up. So that's great. Everybody's back in line again. So,
I think what you said was to me, back in the lanes. I love that
They're back in their own lanes.
So OBR, Bank of England and the government all back in their lanes.
Back in their own lanes.
The markets are responding well to that. So I think in terms of interest rates, originally, as you said, we were expecting potentially the higher end of 6%. We're now looking at the 5% range,
and
are we?
Even saying 4%. So I think it depends on how quickly, obviously, inflation comes down. But, we're seeing sort of inflation decline, for example, in the US. It'll be interesting to see what our next stats show. But I think we are seeing a decrease in discretionary spending. So consumer confidence is going down, business confidence is going down. We are seeing that spending dropping off. So actually inflation is falling back. So we might even end up towards the lower end of those interest rates.
Indeed, because I think America posted just over 7%, whereas we're still around that 9-10% mark. So sort of behind America's progress at the moment. And there were some headwinds, weren't there, that weren't mentioned in the budget?
Yeah, so one thing that I noticed was we're talking a lot about wages at the moment, and we're seeing the public sector coming out and asking for wage increases, so be that sort of teachers, nurses, etc. Also the private sector as well, so trade drivers, mail workers, etc. And that's understandable in a cost of living crisis, got high levels of inflation and wages aren't keeping up. We have negative real wage growth, so it's understandable that people are asking for those wage increases, but it's not clear that we can afford it. So it's not clear that the government has any money left to pay for these, and how government departments would squeeze out these wage increases, I have no idea. And the same in the private sector. The private sector has been quite good at passing through cost increases to customers to date. It's losing the ability to be able to do that. So it's not clear that we can afford those. And if they don't happen, what happens? Are we going to end up in a winter of discontent, strikes, etc.? And if so, we see that decrease in productivity and it potentially pushes us further into recession. And that would be disappointing. Obviously, the government's autumn statement, I think, shallowed that recession that we're forecasting. If we do go into that winter of discontent, we will end up with that deeper recession. That will obviously hurt businesses.
So obviously looking for economic boosts, but we're not going to get it if the productivity puzzle remains a puzzle still.
Yeah, we're not going to get it if nobody's at work, essentially. If nobody's at work and get to work, etc. We're just not going to have growth, are we? So, yeah.
Yeah, and how about the scale of government borrowing?
I mean, yeah, so that's another interesting fact. So again, the level of gilts being put into the market as a result of government borrowing are higher than we've ever seen before. And it's actually higher than during COVID, because during COVID, the Bank of England was going through its quantitative easing, so it was soaking up some of this. This time it's not. So more gilts into the market than ever before. And we don't know how the market's going to react to that. So we really are in uncharted territory.
Unemployment rates look like they might be heading upwards.
Yeah, they are. Unemployment at the moment is broadly equal to the level of vacancies, and that's really tight. So we have a business outlet tracker at GT, and businesses are telling us it's really, really tough to recruit. And part of that is because people haven't come back into the market post-COVID, so our level of inactivity has gone up, migration, etc. But unemployment will go up from that sort of 3.5% to maybe sort of 5%. And I think people are saying maybe a sort of peak at 6.5%. And in some ways, that'll be welcome relief for businesses. The wage pressure will go down and they'll be able to recruit. But putting it into perspective, the average unemployment rate across Europe is only 6.5% currently. So although we're talking about high levels of unemployment, I think we need to put that into perspective.
Yeah, indeed. And we are seeing quite a few recruitment freezes, aren't we? Some larger companies already announcing.
Very much a natural attrition, I think we're calling it. But yeah.
Indeed, and that will feed in to that 6.5% figure, like you said, was in line with Europe. Yeah. Interesting that the OECD yesterday didn't give a particularly good report when it came to the UK and its position within the G7. In essence, we're contracting alongside Germany.
And I think to put that into perspective, in the last couple of years, post-COVID, we've been, I think, in first or second place for growth, and everyone's been praising our growth story. Yes, we were growing, we were doing well, but we also had a deeper decline during COVID than other nations. So partly our strong performance was a result of our poor performance during COVID. So yes, we are now contracting. We're contracting more than others. Part of it's down to our energy policy, etc. Some of the COVID measures have been removed. It's not great. Are we going to see others in Europe then following us? Maybe. But no, clearly, us and Germany, we're not doing particularly well right now. So,
yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Shelley. And so sort of a stable autumn statement outlook, but not necessarily going to answer that productivity.
Oh, no, it's definitely not about growth.
Yeah. No, indeed. Thank you. Alistair, great to get your view now from that government policy perspective, including sharing some insights into the government's direction of travel.
Thank you. So I think timing is key, and I think this was demonstrated in the autumn statement last week. So if you look at it from a Conservative political party perspective, many Conservatives weren't necessarily against the content of the mini budget, and you could have seen a situation or foreseen a situation with interest rates if they were lower than they are presently and not rising, where funding tax cuts through further borrowing would have been palatable to Conservatives, because they want to be seen to be cutting taxes. They've not been able to be in a position, at least since 2019, to be able to offer that. So I think there is, from a political perspective, and we saw this on the benches behind the Chancellor when he spoke in the House, there was silence. Conservatives aren't particularly comfortable with this type of agenda. They know it's necessary, but it's not what they want to be doing. And timing is critical because there's an election coming, and they all know that. And we're beginning to see Conservatives now indicating they won't be standing at the next election. So there is a real nervousness on the party, from the party, and what they want to see is tax cuts. Tax cuts is very difficult for the reasons that Shelley has outlined, and so the Chancellor has tried to steady the ship, and we can expect more in the budget in March 23. It may not be a tax-cutting budget, but he needs to establish a narrative which allows him to, dare I say, the supply side reforms that were mentioned as part of the mini budget reforms. They need to start to generate those opportunities for themselves. And critical, as Shelley noted, is a growth story. There was lots of talk about innovation as a way to deliver growth. If the Chancellor can't find growth in the next 6-12 months, he's going to really struggle to cut taxes in the way that his party wants him to do in advance of an election. So timing is key. And I think you can see that in the actual statement as well, because many of the announcements in terms of spending cuts and indeed tax rises were backloaded. They were all pretty much, the vast majority were designed to come in after the next election. So there is a timing element to all of this, which I think is really critical. And getting that productivity puzzle solved is something Conservatives have done before. When I was in the business department under Greg Clark, we wrote a lengthy tome, I think 348 pages of an industrial strategy, most of which was really an academic thesis on how to solve the productivity puzzle. Greg Clark is back in an influential position. We have reset the clock, to come back to the timing point. And I think the Conservatives, if they have enough run rate, that's where they want to focus. They need to see that growth story so that they can please their backbenchers and stand a chance of being elected at the next election.
And how free is Jeremy Hunt? Is Rishi Sunak checking his homework, or is he a chancellor in his own right?
Well, so I think Jeremy Hunt has the respect both of the backbenchers, actually of the opposition as well. He is well regarded, and it was a strong move from the Prime Minister, who's made perhaps some other less wise moves in terms of forming his cabinet. But the Prime Minister is a very significant role. We've seen him on the world stage. He was at COP27. Admittedly, he was perhaps dragged there, but he was there, and he is presenting on the world stage. He was in Ukraine at the weekend. So the Prime Minister is a very busy man. He needs someone he can trust. He can clearly trust Jeremy Hunt, although there has been some indications he may have been the source of some of the comments regarding the EU that were in the papers last Sunday. So I think there's a trust relationship there, and I would be willing to bet that he will stay the course up until the next election. So I think they have that respect. But the Prime Minister is a busy man. There's an awful lot to do on that increased world stage, because that's really important. Going back to our growth story, we need to demonstrate we can deliver on the world stage. Now we don't have that economic bloc of Europe to support us. So he needs to be presenting out internationally as much as possible. That
international focus. So hard choices sounds like still to be made. Anything on energy support that is worth mentioning?
There's an awful lot, and I think we'll go into some of that detail in the second section. But I think the key highlights were the Chancellor and the Prime Minister clearly view the energy sector as being mature now, hence why you're seeing new windfall taxes on renewables generation. Worth noting that's legacy, older renewables generation, so biomass and schemes supported by the renewables obligation. So they are seeing it as the energy sector as a source of income for pretty much the first time in that way. Obviously, the oil and gas sector have been asked to dig into their pockets again. That sector has been targeted before as well. And the key driver of inflation has been the energy price caps. They've been extended for domestic customers, but the Chancellor was silent on what measures will come for business and for public authority organisations. So there was some beginnings of pitch rolling, but nothing was stated. So again, looking forward to Budget 23 in March, I would expect more detail, because the timing is running tight. We can expect support for business to be significantly reduced and targeted, perhaps more towards SMEs.
OK, thank you very much. Karen, if I can bring you in now. What's your initial reaction on the general business statement to the autumn statement from that tax perspective, please?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd probably echo a lot of what Shellyan said. This was a budget that was about creating stability, getting the market settled. After the debacle of the mini budget, it was very much around that stability and the focus. When the Chancellor talked a lot about his priorities, the three priorities being stability, growth and public services. And there was a lot about stability. There was a lot of measures around public services, but there was very little on growth. And I think that's probably echoing some of what Shellyan said. Certainly, there was nothing really in terms of tax measures that would stimulate growth. And it's interesting because that's some of the things that we are seeing from our clients through the business tracker, is that they would like to see more stimulus, more incentives for capital investment, for tech, for digital, for all the things that automation, the things that they're investing in. So we didn't see any of that. We didn't have any surprises, and we didn't have any rabbits out of the hat. So I think that was what we expected to see. And one of the things that was interesting to me, you can probably tell I'm Scottish. I actually live in the Northwest. I've lived in the Northwest for quite a while.
Northwest of England?
Northwest of England,
yes.
Sorry, not Northwest of Scotland. Sorry, Northwest of England. And I travel a lot. So it was really interesting for me to see the sort of recommitment that was made, not an increase, but at least a recommitment towards things like HS2 and towards sort of Northern Power Rail, which will be, quite transformational, I think. And that's really important in terms of that Northern economy and the whole levelling up agenda. So it was really interesting to see that.
And I suppose the digital connectivity as well.
Absolutely, and around the broadband, super broadband, etc., super fast broadband. So all of that, I think, was really important, and that was encouraging. But there wasn't a lot, as I say, around any specific tax measures. investment zones, those, I got really excited about those at the mini budget. They sounded, sounded great, didn't they? And then, of course, when it actually came to it, they've kind of backed off that a bit. And there was quite a lot of time invested by some of the local authorities around that. But basically now what they're saying is they're going to be a bit more selective, and they're going to look at where they want those to be, looking at knowledge-focused clusters, I think was the expression that was used.
Do you know what that means?
I'm not entirely sure, but well, it might. It would probably be maybe around where there are universities or other high sort of tech.
Exactly.
We'll hear more about that.
Education, labour, etc.
Yeah.
I think what was interesting that you said about the innovation areas last time, it was a real surprise. All these local authorities were going, are we one of them? Are we named?
Yeah.
So suddenly they were like, but there might be some money here. So you're right, they threw a lot of resources in, started developing all their plans, and then suddenly they've gone.
Yeah.
So,
Which is, it's a bit of a shame, really.
And I think what's really interesting is that actually this morning you addressed members of your own firm to get their assessment on the autumn statement. And I think some of the results are very revealing, aren't they? It'd be interesting to see if the audience feel the same way. And I know you got everybody to basically sum up in one word
what their reaction
was.
Yeah, and I think we're going to share that. Hopefully we're going to sort of share what their reaction was. So this was our 5,500 employee base. We do our live broadcast, GT Live, every quarter. And we actually asked everyone to sum up in one word what the budget meant to them. Yes, hopefully people can see that now coming through. There's a lot of really quite words on there. And I guess for business people out there, this might give you an idea of the sentiment, because I'd imagine employees from any organisation are going to be feeling pretty much the same thing. So there's a lot of words on there: depressing, worrying, expensive. But then there were some things on there that were more encouraging as well. Some people said it was sensible, some people said it was fair, some people said it was needed and necessary. So I think there's a recognition of that balance, that whilst we might not like some of those measures, and it will mean over time, Abby will talk about some of the tax changes in a minute, over time more and more people are going to be dragged further into the tax net and pay more tax. I think that there's a recognition that where we are now, there had to be something, and that's interesting, because
they're quite
that's
around
the balance.
Stability, isn't it? This is about stability. There's no growth or innovation on there.
No.
Or depressing, worrying. Someone did say sensible.
Someone said terrifying, so I was wondering who that was.
No, that's very interesting. I think that probably does sum up. It'd be interesting, the audience, if they can do that exercise themselves in their own head. I think that'd be interesting to see what word they would sum up the autumn statement. So it does mean that the business support seems very limited, and tax incentives were light on the ground. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there wasn't. I mean, the only thing really that I would say was mentioned in terms of tax incentives is a bit with give with one hand and take with another, and we'll delve into the detail of that in the second session a bit more. Was around R&D, where there was some reduction around SMEs, but then it was a very mixed picture, but then more incentives. So there was some stimulus towards the larger companies with the research and development credit, the RDEC.
Yes, so, and we will cover the RDEC during the private sector session
we'll talk more on that later.
Thank you very much, Karen. Abby, great to get your thoughts in here now. So we would love to find out the key themes and policies for businesses, employers and individuals that came out of the autumn statement. So if we can start with businesses first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. So the key theme in the Green Book, which is what accompanies the autumn statement, was that the government's approach to delivering this fiscal sustainability we've been talking about was that it was underpinned by fairness. And for businesses and employers, what we saw in terms of tax rises there was making those businesses with the largest profits pay their fair share, and also this concept of fairness. So just touching on some of those points. So firstly, for corporation tax, which is a tax correlated to profitability, it was already known that was going to go up 6 percentage points come next April. So it wasn't really surprising. We didn't see much there. The exception to that rule was, as Alistair mentioned, on the energy companies more broadly, and we did see extensions of scope and time in the level of the tax rate. We also saw reconfirmation that the UK would be bringing in the global minimum tax. I don't think that really was a surprise to anyone, but it was very much pitched as businesses paying their fair share.
And that's basically been directed by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation Development, hasn't it?
It has, exactly, and we'll delve into that more in the second session, but it's an inclusive framework of countries. I think we're at plus 141 countries maybe currently on that, who have agreed in principle to implement that. The UK is further ahead than some, but we'll come back to that in more detail shortly. Where we did see some support for businesses was on business rates, and this really was to address some of the inflationary headwinds that businesses are facing. Business rates is a tax paid irrespective of profitability, which is probably some of the reason why the support was focused there. As has been noted, although the growth word was used a lot, we saw very little there for tax incentives, apart from that mixed picture on R&D. I don't think that was a real surprise given the fiscal constraints, but the PM in his previous role as Chancellor at the beginning of the year had very much laid the ground for that in his May's lecture, and talked about people, capital and ideas as sort of the keys to unlock economic productivity and growth. Of course, a lot's changed since then. And this was about stability, as we said. But we know now there will be a spring budget for sure. It was confirmed in writing yesterday, if it hadn't been before. And with the upcoming consultation on R&D, which we'll talk about shortly, and the consultation on capital allowances reform, which the government hasn't formally concluded on yet, it will be interesting to see what the spring may bring.
So further consultation on R&D, that's one to watch for as well. How about from an employer's perspective?
Yeah, so for unemployment taxes, the one thing we did see was the secondary threshold for employers' NICs was frozen until 2028. That's expected to bring in some quite chunky figures. They're talking in excess of 5 billion from 24-25 onwards. But of course, the crux of this statement was bringing inflation under control. And if they can do that, freezing the thresholds will have far less of an impact on what that will mean in terms of employment costs in real terms.
And how about for individuals? Because obviously we've got lots of businesses watching, and it is important to think about the individual perspective as well, because it's their employees and clients maybe.
Absolutely. And as we've said, because there was little room to move on raising further taxes from businesses, we did see a lot on the personal tax side. That wasn't necessarily big headlines. We saw big headlines in respect of reducing the additional rate at which people pay the additional rate threshold at which people pay the 45% tax. And we also saw the capital gains tax, annual exempt allowance and the dividend allowance cut from next year and then cut further from the year after. That's quite interesting because those in effect are simplification measures to an extent. It means that it takes a lot of people who have small gains or small dividends from having to file a tax return for those alone. Of course, there's lots of other reasons why they might have to. So it'll be interesting to see what that does more broadly for HMRC resource. They will be more compliant both for businesses both for individuals and for HMRC from that perspective. And then, as we've touched on, most of the other changes were in respect of freezes. That's freezes to the personal allowance and to the thresholds. We already knew they were frozen until 2026, so they've been frozen for a further 2 years till 2028. But as Alistair mentioned, that's really pushing that down the line. It's post the next election, we've got a plan, but a lot could change in that time as well.
Absolutely. And Karen, that word simplification, that's music to many of your clients' ears. As you mentioned, the Business Outlook Tracker, that's what people wanted, didn't they?
They did want simplification, and we didn't see any of that. In fact, one of the other few things that were announced in the original mini budget was the abolition of the Office for Tax Simplification, and that hasn't been backtracked on, so it'll be quite interesting to see what happens with that. I've been doing tax for 36 years now. I know you wouldn't know by looking at me, but of course. But I've been doing that a long time, and it just gets more and more complex, and the volume of the legislation gets bigger and bigger. So yeah, I don't think we're going to see much in the way of simplification soon.
And I don't know about you, but I was hoping, I have to be apolitical, but the apprenticeship levy was expecting maybe something along those lines, as was many other businesses and organisations, but we didn't hear very much, did we?
There was nothing on the apprenticeship levy. There was nothing around skills or talent, really. We did expect that. I think that was one of the things we said we were going to talk about. We didn't get that. And it's interesting because coming back to our Business Outlook Tracker as well, the two things so we asked 600 mid-market business leaders following the mini budget what things would make the biggest difference, what would they like to see. The two things they said were simplification of the tax system, which we talked about already, and the second thing was incentives for employers to invest in skills attraction and we didn't see anything on that either. So it feels a bit like a bit of a missed opportunity almost, or a bit of a, missed a trick reel there.
It does. And maybe next year then there'll be more time to look at the skills area, because I know it's something the Prime Minister has spoken about, but we didn't see very much in the autumn statement, did we?
Going back to what Karen was saying, was in the same business outlook tracker, businesses were telling us that they were cutting back on pretty much all non-discretionary spending, and that included around talent development, R&D, etc., because they need to be able to demonstrate to lenders that they can, afford the, afford the working capital that they need at the moment during recession. So I think it's disappointing maybe that the government didn't look to support some of that sort of talent development.
Indeed. So that really concludes part one. And thank you to Shelley and Alistair, who are both leaving the programme. But Alistair's going to be joining the public sector session. So we're going to split the atom with you. Yep. And I know that's going to be chaired by Rob Turner. And I'll be introducing you to Dan and Lindsay in just a few minutes' time, who are going to be joining us for the private sector session alongside Karen and Abby, who are going to be staying around with me. And just to remind you, towards the end of the broadcast, you have an opportunity to have your questions answered. So do keep posting your questions and comments via Slido. The details should be on the screen. As I mentioned earlier, we'll try and get through as many questions as possible. And if you would like a specific speaker to answer the question, then pop their name down as well alongside your question. That'd be great for me, so I know your direction of travel as well. So what we're going to do now, as I said, is we're going to say hello to the public sector session, who I think are on standby. Alistair's going to peel away in just a moment. So if you've registered for the public sector session, then you're going to be taken to another room, and that's going to be done by magic. And if you're staying with us for the private sector session, then we're going to carry on in here, and it's good to have your company as well. So before we actually start the second session, while we're getting ready for that, let's take a quick look at some of the key changes from the budget before we dive into the analysis for the private sector session with our panel. So as was anticipated, the majority of tax rises were focused on individuals. As a result, millions will pay more tax over the coming years. The most significant measures included a reduction in the threshold for additional rate income taxpayers, which will come into place in spring next year. Also, there's a freeze on national insurance thresholds for an additional 2 years until 2028. And the announcement that the dividend allowance will be halved from April next year and then halved again. Although aimed at individuals, these changes will of course have a knock-on effect on businesses, both in terms of their employees and their customers or clients. And Abby on our panel will be discussing in more detail what businesses should be thinking about to support employees. Now, while there weren't as many explicit business tax rises announced, the statement did not include much additional tax support for businesses, as we've just been discussing. It was reconfirmed in the statement that the corporation tax rate will still rise by 6 percentage points in April to 25%, which will coincide with the end of the super deduction for capital investment, and an increase in the diverted profits tax rate, which will increase from 25% to 31%. For multinational enterprises, it was confirmed the UK will implement the Pillar 2 global minimum tax rules, which will come into effect at the end of 2023. And Dan's going to be explaining what exactly that could mean for multinational businesses. There was a mixed picture for research and development, with the government seeking to optimise its return in this area. From the 1st of April 2023, there'll be reforms to research and development tax reliefs. On the one hand, the research and development expenditure credit rate will be increased, while there's also been a significant decrease in the R&D SME scheme deduction rate from 130% to 86%. From the same date, the SME credit rate will also decrease from 14.5% to 10%, as Lindsay will be telling us about in more detail later. A silver lining for businesses was a significant business rates package of support worth £13.6 billion, which seeks to help soften the blow of rising bills following the revaluations of properties effective on the 1st of April next year. The business rates multiplier, which usually rises with inflation, will be frozen for another year, which, with inflation currently in double figures, will be welcomed by businesses. And Abby will be looking at some of the additional support that is available, including support for the hospitality, retail and leisure sectors. So I hope that's given you an overview of some of the key headlines. And welcome to the second part of this broadcast, where we'll be focusing on the private sector session and looking into more details of the announcements that we heard from the autumn statement just last week, and what impact any new tax measures will be on businesses and individuals. And we'll also be talking about the steps that you can take to build and strengthen your business resilience, and how the Grant Thornton team can help you as well. So do remember to keep your questions and comments coming in via Slido. And as I mentioned earlier, joining Karen and Abby are two new panellists for the programme, although not new to Grant Thornton. And first of all, I'd like to welcome Lindsay Copeland, who's the Innovation Tax Partner. And Lindsay, I know you have decades of experience and looking good on it. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I started my career with Grant Thornton Melbourne, actually, and I worked in the government programmes and policy team there. So I've worked in government funding my entire life. Migrated back home, and I've worked for GT UK for about 7-8 years now, and now I've got the privilege of leading the team, so I thoroughly enjoy my job. We get to work with some brilliant clients. So.
Brilliant, and I know you'll be talking about the RDEC,
yes,
among other things as well, so but yeah, be looking forward to finding out your points on the detailed analysis from your perspective. And also with us for the private sector session is Dan Dickinson, an international tax partner with over 13 years experience in longer than that, is it? 19. That's why I need my glasses, actually. It does say 19 years experience. Sorry, I needed my glasses, obviously, in advising multinational enterprises as they expand and operate cross-border, and so much more. Nearly 20 years.
That's right, you've summarised it already.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, it's good to be back here again with you doing these panels in this boiling hot room. But yeah, looking forward to talking about Pillar 2 and things like that. So
yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And good to have you back again, Dan, as well, with all your 20 years of experience nearly, so there we go. Lindsay, if I can start with you. The autumn statement was generally quiet, as we've heard, for many businesses when you compare it to other budgets, aside from the research and development announcements. So what's your take on what the budget means for private sector businesses of all different sizes? And I say different sizes because I know that joining us are many large and mid-market businesses, but that's not the complete picture when we see our audience profile. It's all sizes are welcome here.
Yeah, definitely. So, I think to summarise, the SMEs have probably been, detrimentally impacted by these changes, and those claiming under the large company scheme have had the rate, as you mentioned, increase from 13% to 20%, which is quite a seismic shift. I think one of the things that's actually important to pause and think about is not just the direct impact on the SMEs, but also what that's going to mean for innovation generally within the United Kingdom. So, not having as much assistance in the SME space means that innovation is going to be slowed slightly. It's going to impact supply chains, and also it's not a bad idea for companies who claim in the large company to have a bit of a look at their supply chain and see and work with their supply chain to see, are you going to be detrimentally impacted? Is this going to impact the cost of subcomponents of services, more widely, in the economy?
Indeed, and I know currently claimants provide the information they choose in the format they choose in the UK. And actually, I mean, this pulls into your Australian experience, but other countries around the world, that we seem to be moving, don't we, to following in the footsteps of other countries. And I know that's right up your street. You know all about that.
Yeah, it is definitely. So I think as part of the consultation that was recently announced as well is I think HMRC is going to seek to rationalise the regimes a little bit more, making it easier for them to police them, to review them, which is actually quite a positive thing. Also, in terms of streamlining it, as you've correctly pointed out, companies at the moment can just give HMRC whatever information they want, but all of the other jurisdictions that are in Western societies have quite a prescribed methodology of what's the data and the information that they require. And again, what that helps the tax authorities do is, police it and review it with a bit more objectively and a little bit less emotionally. And so actually they can really target the reviews that they do, combat fraud a little bit better. And so then actually they've got more, sort of almost a better handle on actually where the fraud might be. So they managed to manage those schemes a little bit better.
So it sounds like it's going to be a lot more prescriptive and following the lines of Australia, United States,
US,
Canada, those kind of countries indeed. And then in terms of, we mentioned the RDEC, so the Research and Development Expenditure Credit, and again, upcoming consultations on that. And again, that's an area of focus for you as well, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. The upcoming consultation is going to be around whether they're going to actually migrate the two regimes together and have one single rate. So this recent autumn statement has been limiting and minimising the SME benefit available, but also increasing the RDEC benefit that's available for large companies. And so the next logical evolution might be to actually do what some jurisdictions do and just have one single regime into which any company of any size can make a claim. And again, there's benefits to that. One, again, it might mean that the SME tax credit amount doesn't go back to what it formerly used to be, but it just might mean that actually from policing it and from actually administering the regimes, that it's actually a lot easier on the public purse, because HMRC doesn't need to have quite so many resources to police it and check and challenge it.
And I suppose what comes next down the track then, in terms of if we are going to have a look at the RDEC, are we adding certain things into the mechanism and taking things away? So I think when we had a chat earlier, it was about cloud computing being added in. So yeah, just to elaborate on that, I think that'd be really useful to hear.
So one of the consultations that happened last year that we consulted on as well was the HMRC is seeking to change the legislation ever so slightly in the new year. And they're permitting the addition of cloud computing cost, which is a really positive thing, because that's something that's quite a significant, lot of expenditure for some companies. They're seeking to broaden the definition of R&D to include pure maths. And again, that's going to have a really positive impact on companies as well. One thing that they are seeking to remove is the ability to include overseas resources, that overseas R&D effort in UK tax claims.
So removal of overseas activities.
Exactly, and that's in line with the Australian regime, which is, has a similar composition to us. It's an island nation surrounded by, economies with lower cost labour forces. So it's kind of aligning to that as well. There's a lot of hurdles to be able to claim overseas costs in Australia. So one of the things that, those regime changes that came about from the first consultation earlier this year, R&D is going through a lot at the moment, paired with the rate change, is for large companies, they're more likely to be impacted by the removal of overseas resources. We see that it's usually large companies that use overseas resources. So that increase in the RDEC rate will help to kind of plug the gap there a little bit. Hopefully. So
it does seem that they want to simplify it, but like you said, it could be that larger companies benefit and the SMEs, which traditionally might be more difficult to audit. Is that where? Yeah,
I think, and again, the OECD have also kind of come out and when they've done their assessment and said actually the return on investment on the RDEC is better than it is in the SME scheme. And there's been a lot, as you'll have all seen the news, there's been a lot around, fraudulent activities in the SME space, which is disappointing and unfortunate, because there are a huge number of SMEs that make legitimate claims and do really good innovative work. So it's unfortunate. It feels like they've maybe been penalised slightly because of the behaviours of a few.
It does feel they've been penalised, but I think there's going to be a review as well, just to double check that those SMEs that are compliant don't necessarily miss out as well. So as a result of everything you've said, what should businesses be thinking or doing, and how can sort of Grant Thornton and the team help?
Yeah, definitely. I think planning is the key. So just being ready for these changes that are going to be up and coming in April. Having a really clear lens on what the impacts are going to look like. We've worked a lot with our clients in terms of the sort of wins and the losses, within all of the regime changes. So how much overseas activity do you undertake? Do you have the data to be able to assess that and easily pull that out of your claim? Making sure you've got cloud computing costs, documented and well looked at. And the other holistic thing as well is just making sure your claim is optimized, and making sure that, you take a fresh look at it. Are you including everything to which you're entitled to include in the claim? Because again, businesses are, busy, they're busy doing their actual day job. So a lot of the times we will see people leave things on the table because it's put in the too hard basket. I'd really go back and assess those things to help bolster your claim, and look at other funding that's available. I think as part of the announcement, they said that Innovate UK is going to get a lot more funding as well. And so actually those funds are prospective. So don't commit to a project until you've kind of got and applied for your Innovate UK funding. But for SMEs, the co-contribution from Innovate UK is up to 50%, whereas historically the SME regime was only up to 33%. So you can, if you plan well and you have a look at what else is available, you can plug the gap.
Yes, and aside from Innovate UK, how about patent box? Is that something that is worth bringing to people's attention?
Definitely, particularly with the tax rate increasing, patent box is going to be a lot more beneficial to companies as well. So yeah, that's definitely something to look at too.
Okay,
yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And Dan, if I can bring you in now, I know we want to look at multinational enterprises and how the announcements impact them. And I noticed some announcements regarding implementing the OECD's minimum tax Pillar 2 proposals, which we've already spoken about already. I think it'd be really worthwhile actually elaborating on what Pillar 2 is, but also maybe talk about Pillar 1 very briefly so people know the differences between the two.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nadine. As a reminder, the OECD's looked into perceived tax avoidance by multinationals and their overall tax burden around the world. And the outcome of that work has been two proposals, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is about the allocation of profits across the different countries and jurisdictions that you operate in. Those rules are only going to apply to multinationals with turnover above 20 billion a year. So we're not going to focus on those rules today, but just as a reminder, they're there and they're called Pillar 1. What we're going to focus on today is that I'll go on to explain is Pillar 2, which is the minimum tax rate proposals, which the G20 finance ministers announced. Remember that picture where they're all stood on the steps, sort of woohooing about it maybe 18 months or so ago. These rules are going to apply to multinationals with turnover above 750 million euros a year, so a lot wider application to different businesses. So that's just as a reminder. So focusing on Pillar 2, what are the rules, first of all? So really broadly, the UK has reconfirmed that it will implement Pillar 2 with effect from accounting periods beginning after the 31st December 2023. So in the context of what I'm about to explain, not very long away. What do those rules contain? They contain an income inclusion rule. So where if you're a UK company that has overseas subsidiaries underneath you in your group structure, and those subsidiaries have an effective tax rate of less than 15%, you're going to pay a top-up tax in the UK up to the 15%. Flipping it on its head, if you're a UK entity that's owned by someone overseas, if your UK tax rate is below 15% under these new calculations, you'll pay what's called a minimum tax in the UK as well. So that hopefully sounds reasonably simple, but actually it's not the way the rules have been implemented. It's very accounting based, and you're going to have to, as a group, apply lots of different accounting methodologies to your overseas subsidiaries that you won't have been doing to date. So it's kind of almost doubling up some of your requirements from a financial reporting and tax reporting purposes, just to show what number you should be filing somewhere if you should be paying any extra tax.
And you mentioned actually this has come into effect at the end of 2023, so in effect from the 1st January 2024. But actually it could impact businesses sooner than that. So it might be worth explaining why, as soon as June, July, that people are going to have to really get their acts together.
Yeah, well, there's a few different strands to that question. I mean, the UK, as Abby said in the first session, there's going to be a finance bill in spring that will include the legislation in the UK that's now been consulted on already. We fed into that consultation and said a few things that we thought we could make simpler. That legislation will come out draft in spring. And actually, when it receives royal assent, we don't know when that will be. It'll be the king for the first time, right? But the king will do it, in the summer. So if you're a multinational with a June or September year end, you're going to have to think about how that should be reflected in your 2023 accounts. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is more like a sort of forward-looking planning aspect. So, as a finance or tax team, you're going to be having to ask for a lot more resources here to deal with this, whether that's internal or external providers. And actually, if you can't say what extra burden you're going to have, how are you going to get that extra resource that you're going to need? And the other part of it is just forward planning. If you're expanding overseas, changing your operations, actually, you're going to have to factor this potential extra tax burden into that as well. And so, lots of sophisticated organisations do 3-5 year forecasts on earnings per share, which includes your effective tax rate. You need to be knowing what your effective tax rate is now to be able to do those forecasts and talk to the market.
And just from your sense of what's going on out there, how have you seen multinationals reacting so far?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest, depending on what the multinational organisations think their position's going to be. The first movers tended to be ones where they're probably headquartered in low or zero tax jurisdictions, and equally some UK businesses that knew they structurally had a low effective tax rate kind of instinctively. They've been the ones to first move and start doing some calculations. Other organisations where they tend to operate in, let's say, your higher tax jurisdictions mostly, it's been a bit slower in how they've taken it up. They're more working on instinct as to, we don't think we'll have to pay any extra tax under these rules, so let's kind of park it given everything else we've got going on in the economy that Shelley and Alistair were talking about. So it has been a bit of a mixed bag, but even the organisations now that feel they won't have any tax to pay, they're really starting to get their head around the extra resources they need to meet their reporting requirements.
And I suppose those groups headquartered in territories with low or zero headline CT rates were the first to start analysing the potential tax cost impact.
Yeah, because they instinctively knew that they would have extra tax to pay.
Yeah.
I think for other groups that instinctively think they don't, it's not as simple as that. So, Lindsay talked really articulately about RDEC and Patent Box. Incentive regimes like that around the world, it's complex how they'll be dealt with for Pillar 2 purposes, so whether they're good or bad for Pillar 2. So the RDEC in the UK, because it's a refundable credit, will probably be good for Pillar 2 and like okay, blessed tax incentives. Patent Box won't be, because that's a tax rate cut down to 10%. And so if you've got a UK business that's making huge Patent Box claims, actually you need to think about Pillar 2, because you might not be paying tax at 10, you might be paying it at 15.
And I suppose on that then, so the key thing is not to think instinctively, actually prepare and find out exactly what you need to do, because instinctively I don't think it's going to be the answer.
No, that's right. I mean, like you said, I've been doing this for 20 years and I've learned over 20 years not to be instinctive about these sort of rules. They're very complicated and you'll be surprised. Lots of different countries are introducing the rules at different times. You need to look at your financial data reporting. Can you collect all this data and really start doing it now, because, it's not that long away when the rules will come in.
And I suppose the US is a big player in all of this, isn't it?
Yeah, the US is really interesting in that they tend to do their own thing around tax policy. So I think it's called the Anti-Inflation Act recently, and they included their own version of minimum tax rules, which has the 15% number in it. But actually the rules aren't viewed as being OECD compliant. So if you're a US multinational with big UK operations and then foreign things underneath the UK, you're almost like tripling up your compliance, because you have to do US calculations, you have to do UK calculations, and you have to do whatever the overseas territories are doing as well. So, if you're a US multinational or a UK multinational with big US operations, you really need to be tracking that development as well.
Now, we mentioned that people want simplification. So how can Grant Thornton help them? Have you got any tools at your disposal that you can help people with this? Because it does sound a lot more complicated than when you scratch the surface.
Yeah, there you go. No, the way we're approaching it actually is, the more I've looked at it and the international tax team have looked at it, it's not just a tax thing, it's a financial reporting and data thing as well. So the way we've approached it is a kind of multidisciplinary effort with colleagues from business consulting who do a lot around data and financial reporting systems. And so what we're looking at now is both a kind of gap analysis on data and financial reporting, and then with a tax impact assessment tool as well. And what we're saying to our clients that we're working on those with at the moment is start doing that early, because that will show you where your gaps are in your data, and it'll show you whether your instinct is correct as to whether you've got no extra tax to pay or you actually do, and then you can kind of focus your efforts as next year develops into the areas that you need to make sure you're compliant.
And the other thing is that transfer pricing documentation. Is that of interest, do you think, to talk about?
Yeah, it should be, and so that's kind of well trailed as well. We've had a consultation in the UK on that. This was announced, or reconfirmed in the autumn statement. The UK government is going to now require you to have timely transfer pricing documentation prepared for UK operations. It's quite a UK way of announcing the law. It's a little bit vague and nice. It doesn't say you have to submit that with your tax return. It says when you submit your tax return, you have to have it ready. And if we ask for it, you have to give us it within 30 days. So a lot of groups don't have UK documentation in place or up to date at the moment. And we're advising all clients to do that as soon as possible, given this law change.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Abby, if I can bring you in now. The announcements, weren't they? They were heavily focused on tax rises for individuals, both through freezing of bans, as we've mentioned, allowances for a further 2 years, and the reduction of the level at which employees pay the additional rate of income tax. So in an environment where, there's those cost of living challenges and they're rising, and also there's that competition for talent, although we have noted that the unemployment rate is going up as well, it's expected to rise. What should businesses be thinking about against that backdrop?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. So I think the first thing to note, obviously, is employees are facing these challenges, but so are businesses as well. So I just wanted to quickly recap on what we did see in the statement first. So as I mentioned, the employer's NICS threshold is frozen till 2028, and that, as inflation drives wages upwards, will increase the bill. The slight good news in that for smaller businesses was that they reconfirmed that the employment allowance, which smaller businesses can offset against their NICS liabilities, will stay at the enhanced level of £5,000 up until 2026. But you're absolutely right. Most of the measures were on individuals, and they'll be the ones feeling the squeeze. So a couple of things that businesses can think about, and this is very much not what was in the autumn statement to help, but what can businesses do outside of the autumn statement? I mean, the only thing we did see from the autumn statement was confirmation of the trajectory of company car tax rates up until 2028. That does show that they'll start increasing 1% from 25 onwards, and for EVs, we will see an increase up to 5% from 2028. It will start going up in 25 and then reach 5% in 28. And that does provide some certainty when employees are taking out their leases, for example, on what their position will be. But then moving outside of the autumn statement, there were a couple of things, and going back to your question, that I wanted to mention. So firstly, we actually had a GT Employers Forum. We run a GT Employers Forum, which anyone can sign up through our website. And that had a recent session on optimising employment costs. So definitely worth a watch. But a few other things that we've seen. So the provision of salary advances. There's been some big names in the press recently who have provided these to employees to help with the cost of living, and also to avoid them going for payday loans as well, which have much higher interest rates. But there are tax issues to consider in that. It was really welcome that actually just last week HMRC provided an update which has confirmed that we will see amendments to secondary legislation, and that confirmed two things. So it first clarified the tax position, which is always welcome to business and us as tax advisors, and also the tax reporting point as well for those salary advances. So hopefully that eases some of the considerations.
Because up until last week, that was pretty much an unregulated area, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I think unregulated is perhaps looking at how the finance is regulated, and that probably falls outside of tax. But what there was a lot of ambiguity on when employers needed to report it through their payroll and report in real-time information to HMRC. And it was, should it be at the time of the advance? Should it be before the contractual pay date? And so what that update has done is confirmed at the point that it should be reported.
And just on those advanced loans, that's a business decision to make to help those individuals, those employees, but also if they've got the working capital to be able to do it as well. Is that something to consider?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not an expert in how they work, but my understanding is you can do it two ways. So you as employers can provide the payment advance, or you can facilitate it through a third party.
Right.
So I think there's two options.
Yes.
Options there to explore. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of those sort of salary advances, that's something I'm sure like the likes of Tesco, they announced recently as well. The other thing that I think was really, really important to think about is those business rates, which you mentioned earlier too. And this is the one area where there has been some support offered for businesses, hasn't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think to put this into context, as I mentioned earlier, businesses pay business rates on property, and that's irrespective of whether they're making profit or losses. So what we've seen is really welcome. Part of the context of that is from April 2023, businesses will be facing new business rates bills, and that's based on property revaluations to reflect market conditions. The last revaluations were in 2017, so for many, they'll see increased bills. So in total, there's a 13.6 billion support package. A couple of points to draw out of that. The key thing and the biggest part of that support package was the freezing of the business rates multiplier for another year. And given that that usually rises with inflation, I think we've all seen where inflation is. That's really welcome news. There was also amendments to transitional relief. So that means that those businesses that have seen a reduction in their bill through those revaluations can see the benefit of that immediately, whereas previously it was spread over a number of years. And then on the flip side, those that have seen increases in their bills will see some support there as well. And then, as you mentioned, there's some specific relief. So for retail, hospitality and leisure, there's an increase in the rate of relief up to 75% for another year. So I think that's really helpful to those businesses on the high street that are facing increased costs. And we also saw some for small businesses. The other thing that was on the table was online sales tax, and that was tabled in part to pay for business rates reform. I just wanted to highlight that was quite quietly, there was no fanfare about it, but quietly dropped for complexity reasons, because it would create distortions, and we're yet to see the summary of responses, but that will just provide more rationale for the reason it won't change that it's been dropped.
Brilliant. Thank you, Abby. And do keep your questions coming in via Slido. Details should be on the screen. We'll be doing a Q&A session just towards the end. Karen, if I can bring you in now, how about for privately held businesses? So private equity ones or whatever comes under that, or privately owned. There didn't seem to be any significant big announcements in the autumn statement. I know they always expect to see something on capital gains tax, but sadly disappointed. But is there anything else that these businesses...
I don't think disappointment. I think they were relieved is probably the right answer there. Yeah, I mean, I guess just before we talk about capital gains tax, I guess one area that it's probably worth just reminding people, and it's not being talked about a lot, is that we had that whole cokey, if you remember, about the 25% rate, and Lindsay mentioned it in terms of the benefit of the reliefs and things. So, we had the 25% rate, it was coming in, then in the mini budget said it's not coming in, and then it's come back. It was confirmed that that's staying. So from next April, we're going to have a 25% tax rate for all companies, other than some of the smaller ones who will be able to benefit slightly from the small companies rate. So I guess one of the things I would say is that businesses should be thinking now about anything they might be able to do to help enhance or plan around that 25% rate coming in. So, for example, if you can perhaps defer some expenditure and get higher relief on it for things like R&D, capital allowances, other areas, things like use of losses as well. If you've got losses, thinking about how you might be able to push some of those losses and get a high rate of relief, because it's a big difference, the 6% difference, isn't it, between the current rate of 19 and 25 that's coming in next year. So those would be some things I'd be kind of highlighting for businesses. Coming back to the question of capital gains, what we've seen over, probably the last few years, what we've seen is a sort of speculation that, and certainly the direction of travel appears to be, whatever colour government we have, the direction of travel feels that we're moving much more towards aligning corporation tax and corporation capital gains and income tax rates. At the moment, there's a big difference, obviously, between the top rate of 45% for income tax and the 20% top rate, up 28% for residential property, but in a business context, 20% rate for shares. So that's a really big difference. And what we've seen is a lot of deal activity. There's been masses and masses of deal activity going on. So that's really quite interesting, because I think, obviously, in the current sort of world where we're potentially in recession, well, I think we were told we were in recession, although I'm not sure that economically we are, but in that sort of world, and you think, well, there'll be some dampening on some of that transactional activity, I think it's quite interesting, because we may now find a situation, I think, where a lot of people who are thinking about succession, and I use succession in its widest form, and that might be passing on business to the next generation, it might be thinking about an IPO, a management buyout, a sale, trade sale, bringing private equity in. Now's a really good time to do that, because we've got a relative certainty. I can't imagine anything, I could be proved wrong, but I can't imagine that there will be any change in that capital gains rate now before the next election in 2024. So that gives a nice time frame, I think, for people to start to think about some of the things that, if they are thinking about that, don't wait too long, because these things been through quite a few of these transactions over the years, they take longer than you think. And if you want to maximise your value, you need to start planning now. I mean, that's probably a bit of a plug for our guys on the deals and the M&A side, but actually starting to really think about that and plan so that you get the maximum value. It's really important.
Because we've seen quite a few businesses completing those transactions before the autumn statement, following your advice. And actually, so you're saying sort of the next year and a half is the time to get your house in order in many ways before anything major comes down the track further. And the budget did really sort of focus, didn't it, on sort of that fiscal drag and those reduction of annual exemptions. So it'd be good to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's interesting because other than and I think Abby touched on this earlier, other than the reduction on the additional rate from that 150,000 level, the 45% rate coming down to 125,140, there wasn't anything immediate really in terms of income tax rises as such. So a lot of it is about freezing of allowances. A lot of that's pushed out. And the whole thing about the fiscal drag really is that more and more people come into that tax net as inflation feeds through. More people are facing higher rates of tax that's sort of a bit hidden. There'd already been an announcement that till 2026 those rates were going to stay in place. We now know that's going to be 2028, and as inflation sort of has an impact, that will mean more and more people are being pulled into that, into the top rate bands. So you'll see that happening more.
And I suppose the autumn statement gave some certainty to businesses, didn't it? So, which is a good thing, certainly in the short term. Yeah. And just picking up on that point about, that succession planning, which is, always wise advice anyway. But those employee ownership trusts, they seem to be gaining traction as well. So have you seen that as well, the popularity
we have. I mean, it's interesting because I've had a few clients who have gone down the route of looking at exiting the business. It might be because they're coming towards a retirement event, or some people post the lockdown and COVID just decided they want to do something different. So we've seen a lot of activity around that, and sometimes it can be quite difficult for them to achieve the sort of values that they wanted, or on some of this. So it's quite interesting. We're seeing an alternative in terms of people now looking to put the companies into employee ownership. What that does is obviously incentivise the employees. They own the business. It brings that real incentivisation to grow the business. But if it's done in the right way and you sell more than 50% to an employee ownership trust, there's no tax on that. So I'm not saying it's the answer to everything, absolutely not. But it's a really interesting alternative sometimes if you go down the trade route, PE route, and it's maybe not quite working the way you want it to. We're seeing employee ownership trusts as being a really valuable alternative as well.
Something to consider as well. Well, thank you very much, panellists, for the time being. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Thank you very much. You can keep your questions coming in via Slido. Dan, we've got a question for you regarding the OECD Pillar 2 and the new TP documentation rules. It looks like these apply initially to large corporations only. How do we interpret large in these contexts?
So the Pillar 2 rules are your group's global turnover. So even if you're a UK entity as part of that group with 50 million turnover, if the rest of your group adds up to 750 million euros, you have to comply. the rules. The transfer pricing rules are slightly different in that they focus on the EU methodology for that around turnover, but around size of employment base and things like that as well. You tested me on that. I've forgotten the requirements.
Yes, indeed, testing you.
Yeah. But they are slightly different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just staying with that theme, there's still political uncertainty around whether countries will implement P2, including from the EU. Might we see a delay in UK implementation still to come? Although I thought there's been a commitment, hasn't there, by the UK to carry on with it?
Yeah, there has been a commitment. I mean, never say never. You know, we had the mini budget, right, and then that changed for Pillar 2. I mean, the legislation has been through consultation already. It's out there. It's going to be in the spring finance bill. They've committed to that. And if you think about all the political discussion that you had in the session when I was just sat at the back, think about the government's political position. It's quite a hard thing to row back on. You know, if someone got hold of that and said, well, you're rowing back on multinational tax anti-avoidance provisions, that doesn't look very good, does it, from a government perspective anyway? So I'd fully expect the rules to come in when they've said they're going to come in. You know, and then from an EU perspective, you know, the five kind of ringleaders in the EU who are pushing for this to come in at the same time as the UK, they're sticking with it despite what other EU territories are saying about delaying. And it is important to remember that if a big part of your group, that territory has announced the rules, it kind of doesn't matter if other countries in your group haven't, because if you're a UK holding company and we've got the rules, if all the territories underneath haven't implemented the rules, you still have to do all the calculations and the complexity, and then any extra tax and filings will be just made in the UK rather than all those territories.
Yeah.
So it kind of doesn't matter what other countries do. The US on top of the UK is interesting, but equally, I don't think they're going to have OECD compliant rules anytime soon. So again, if the UK introduced it, doesn't matter. You've got to do all that stuff in the UK anyway.
Yeah, just a question I've got actually for the panel. How can, if I'm an employer, best incentivise and retain employees and provide support with the cost of living without putting my business under too much financial pressure? I know we talked about, potentially advanced loans, but in general, what's that sense? What can we play with here?
I guess what I would say would be to think about, clearly it's not just about pay rises, so there's a whole wider piece, isn't there, about, and this isn't tax, really about how you engage your employees. We personally at GT have done a lot of work around well-being, making sure that people are looked after. But I guess there are other things that we've done as well, thinking about benefits, what benefits in kind could be, really beneficial to employees, and also think about, some of the tax efficient benefits which can benefit the company as well, sometimes as well, around things like salary sacrifice, etc. And I guess the other area I would talk about is some of the things that you can do. We were just talking before we came on about we have a reward gateway, which is effectively, it's a shopping gateway, gives discounts in all the major retailers, supermarkets, etc. And that's a great thing for our employees. It's not difficult to really put in place, and there's a platform there that really does allow that. So I think it's just thinking a bit differently about some of these things. We've also done a lot in terms of just financial education of our employees. I mean, obviously we've got a lot of accountants here, so it's not quite the same thing, but some of the stuff around personal finances, especially for some of the younger people within the organisation, and just making sure that people really understand some of that detail as well. So there's a lot of wider things you can do too.
Yeah, very wise words there. And just a sort of a final question before I get you to do a sort of a last sort of soundbite each. Following the autumn statement announcements, what would be your top recommendation to business? So if I can start with you, Lindsay.
So again, if I take it back to R&D tax, it would be preparation is really, really key in terms of making sure that you are, ready for these regime changes, making sure that you're optimising your position in terms of what you're eligible to claim, looking broader than R&D tax, and also sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. So, and also working with your supply chain just to make sure, are there any gaps or holes in that the R&D tax regime changes might not have a direct impact on you, but they might have an indirect impact on you based on the direct impact it'll have on your wider supply chain. So that would be my suggestion.
Very good suggestion. And Dan, how about yours?
I'm going to focus on Pillar 2, as you'd be surprised to hear.
Have you got anything else to say?
No, for organisations that are going to be in the rules or look like they're going to be in, start early next year looking at this, if you haven't already, but focus in, try and get it in a focused way. So do an impact assessment, do a data gap analysis to start off with, because that will hopefully show you where you need to focus, and then you won't have to overinvest cost and resource and time if you're doing it in a panic, when suddenly you realise there's a requirement somewhere or not, or you've got an analyst asking you about it or something like that. There's things you can do early next year, which hopefully won't be a huge amount of time and resources, but kind of set you on the right track.
And so really it's about data and compliance, really, is that the
yeah,
key?
But also don't be instinctive about thinking you're not going to have any extra tax to pay, because we've put some surveys out there and the respondents, it's global, not just the UK, but some surveys out there and the respondents have said that the people who did respond said they're estimating an average effective tax rate increase of 4 to 5%. So, that's big if you're talking about earnings per share and things like that. So again, just don't be instinctive about it. Let's look at it properly with you.
Yeah, wise words. Abby.
Yeah, so I'm going to draw something that wasn't in the statement, if that's okay, but coming back to this wider thing about how we incentivise employees, given the wider scene. And I think my key recommendation for businesses would to look at their hybrid and cross-border working practices. It's a really great way to attract and retain talent, and it's also, from a policy perspective, quite a hot topic right now. We're seeing countries introduce digital nomad visas, and also the Office for Tax Simplification in one of their final acts will be to deliver the conclusions of their hybrid and distance working review. Now, that comes with tax implications, so it's really important that businesses look at their policies, look at what the tax implications will be, and put in place appropriate safeguards to mitigate that risk, but so they can also deliver something that's really beneficial to their employees as well. And that's something that we've got experience and have done for a few clients to help them with that offering. Yeah. In that area.
Sounds good. It actually reflects the way of the world as well, doesn't
it?
Yeah, indeed. And Karen.
So my final kind of take on all of this is listening to everything today and thinking about it, is the theme has to be prepare, plan and prepare. Don't make assumptions. Don't be instinctive. Don't be intuitive. A lot of these things aren't quite how you think they'll be. We talked about the simplification, lack of it. It's not simple. Tax is very complex. So what I'd be saying to people is, whatever area that might be, whether you're thinking about succession, whether you're thinking about the impact of some of the changes of the relief site on the R&D side, whether you're looking at employees or whether you're looking at, Pillar 2, Dan's favourite subject, make sure that you plan and you prepare well. So that would be my sort of final takeaway.
I was going to go back for a final soundbite, but I think we've covered it all off, actually. I think that it would be cruel to get you to do any more, actually, because I think you've all actually sort of nailed it with what are the key recommendations that businesses should be focusing on, also conscious of time as well. So as we start to wrap things up, I'd like to thank Karen, Abby, Lindsay and Dan, and for being part of the private sector session panellists. So please do get in contact with any of them if you'd like some further information, or you can contact your regular Grant Thornton contact, whoever that may be, for more information. And just to let you know, a recording of this show will be made available at some point over the next couple of days. You'll get an email about that so you can watch it all again or share it with your colleagues as a reminder of some of the key points that we've covered off as well. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for sending in your questions and for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us this afternoon. I wish you all the very best over the coming weeks and months. And on behalf of Grant Thornton, thank you so much for watching and goodbye.